Hello, and welcome to the fourth lecture for this class. Today we're going to talk about cataloging and how you put things into libraries and what does that do to the way in which you think about your collection. In terms of the Buddhist canon in China, its very structure was dependent upon the way in which the Chinese catalog things. The Sanskrit tradition just didn't have a catalog in the sense of a library catalog. As we've said before, writing came very late to India, and they just had not developed the whole library science. Whereas for China, it was really an important part of their culture, that you had many manuscripts, you had a long tradition of writing, and you had a long tradition of collecting those writings into a structured environment where you had to reference them. And so we're going to look at this today and see how that affected the Buddhist tradition. The big issue that you have when you start to collect is, how do you house a collection? In what way do you preserve it? It's one thing if you have a few manuscripts which are owned by individuals, like the Sanskrit manuscripts that came to China. They didn't come necessarily in big groups. They came little by little. The acquisition of these was done by these missionary monks who came. Each one had a few manuscripts. So that the Chinese, as they got a hold of these manuscripts, at first there was no collection. There was no concept of a traditional idea of a canon. Each manuscript was considered special. Each manuscript was the equal of any other manuscript. There was, in the beginning, no way to designate them. The scrolls that were brought or the folios that were brought in either birch bark or palm leaves into China were individual items. So the Chinese, as they began to acquire more of these, were forced into a library situation. And the library situation was, how do we deal with this growing group of books, so to speak? Now, when we look at our witnesses, when we talked about this before, what were the Chinese eventually going to have to house in their libraries? So we look at these early witnesses that we have. We have the Kaibao in the first place there, 10th century. We have the so-called Jin edition, the golden edition. You can see that it's in the 12th century. And then you have the Korean edition, which is in the 13th century. When we look at all three of these, we can understand a little bit about what was happening as the collections were being gathered in China. If you look closely at these three, what you will see is that they are tracings. That is, the second and the third one that you see there, if you look closely, you will see that they have traced exactly the characters from the Kaibao. They didn't rewrite the thing in one sense. It was much safer to simply put paper that you could see through down on top of it and trace the characters on that thin sheet of paper. And then that thin sheet of paper was taken and pasted on wood, and they made a carving of it. So what we deal with is, in one sense, you can say, well, the Kaibao has mostly, those blocks are just, they've gone. We only have about 30 maybe examples from the Kaibao blocks. But because it was traced, we can go to the much later, centuries later versions, and it's identical. It's Xerox copies, if you will. So that's why, in terms of what we have in the Chinese Buddhist canon that was being collected by the Chinese, is that even when they printed and made printed copies, it didn't change very much because they traced. Now, when you get a bunch of manuscripts, a bunch of books, then what do you do with it? The first thing is, do you come to the place where you name the collection? If I have a collection of manuscripts, what do I call it? So as time went by and the Chinese began to have more and more manuscripts, first hundreds, and then it grew to thousands. When you have such a large collection of manuscripts, what do you call it? What name do you give it? How do you designate that it is a thing? And this is very crucial because by naming, you indicate that you are dealing with a definite collection of specific materials. So the Chinese were trying to think, how shall we name this collection? As far as we can tell, at first, it wasn't very creative, but they just said, all the Jing, Yi Jie Jing. And that was just a way, it's almost like a plural. Is that we don't know what to name this collection. We'll just call it pluralized, the Jings. What was a Jing? Well, everybody translates it with the Sanskrit word sutra. That is the word of the Buddha. But Jing in Chinese has a very specific meaning. It means texts which contain the teachings of an ancient sage. That's what it Jing is. So it's translated often as classic. The Chinese classics. Not the Chinese books, but Chinese classics. So when Buddhist texts began to come in, and they were brought in by, as we know, Anshe Gao, who was a Parthian prince, at least some connection to the royal family of the Parthians. So The Chinese government wanted to be nice to him. They didn't want to have any trouble with the people on their periphery. They allowed him to call his Buddhist translations Jing, classics. I think that gave Buddhism from the very beginning the feeling that it was indeed legitimate. So the Chinese just said, okay, go ahead, name each translation a Jing, the words of an ancient sage, and pluralize it. All the Jing, the Jing. However, in the Tang Dynasty, a new expression appeared, and it became dominant. The new expression was Da Zhang Jing. Now, I think that this is often very much misunderstood. What does it mean to call the collection the Dazang Jing? What are the Jing? It's the same as we had in the older way of the Yijie Jing, the classics of Buddhism. Dazang, people have tried their best to make it into the traditional Indian form of referring to the Canon as Tripitaka, the three baskets. But that's not what it says. There's no way to make Tripitaka out of this. It's not the tradition of a canon made up of the three baskets, that is, sutras, the word of the Buddha, Vinaya, the rules of conduct for monastics, Abhidharma, the commentaries. The Chinese never, ever divided, or as far as we can tell, made a division into those three elements. And yet we still refer to the Chinese Buddhist canon as the Tripitaka. I don't think it ever was a Tripitaka. It was never three baskets. If it was anything, it was a two-basket thing. It was the words of the Buddha and commentaries. So what does it mean, Dazang Jing? I think it means exactly what was implied when the emperor of the court decided to make printing blocks for the Buddhist canon. He sent off a message, and we're going to talk about this more in a couple of lectures from now. But for the moment, he sent off a letter to Chengdu, which was the wood carving capital of China. And he said, I want you to make a set of printing blocks for the Dazang Jing, not the Yijie Jing, not all the sutras, just the Dazang Jing. What did he mean? It seems that what he really meant was all the Jing that are in the library. Dazang means the great repository, the great treasure trove. And that's what people called libraries, not just Buddhists, but other Chinese traditions call libraries the Dazangs. So I think that the emperor in the northern Song had picked up an older beginning to be heard expression, Dazang Jing, and he made it the name of the Chinese Buddhist canon, and it remains so to this day. Mistranslated often? I think it hasn't been understood. If I'm right, that's what it meant. That it was the library which had put together the text and made it into what we call the Chinese Buddhist canon. Now, how do you house a collection? Particularly scrolls. Scrolls are so unwieldy. So the Chinese libraries, and I can't find a good picture to show you the way they really did it. At least for the Buddhist canon, the libraries took 10 scrolls and put them into what was called a case, a box, a shelf. And so they made shelves that would hold 10 scrolls. So the whole thing of the thousands of scrolls that made up the Chinese Buddhist canon, they were separated into units of 10 that had a library shelf structure that handled them. With that in mind, we can now see that if you're putting all the material into a shelving situation where 10 scrolls go together, that in and of itself is a division of the canon. You are making divisions just by housing, just by the way in which you put it up on the shelf. So how do you keep track of that? How do you know which box has what? Or if the scroll I have a scroll and I want to know where to put it, where to shelve it, how do I know which shelf to put it in? As you can see with this very wild picture of scrolls, you wouldn't know where to put it. There's no indication. But the Chinese that put the Buddhist canon, they knew exactly which box it went in. We call it a case, not a box. They put it in the right case. But in order to put it in the right case, you have to catalog. That is, you not only have to have some designation on the shelf as to where you're going to put it, but you have to indicate eventually on the material that you have which part of the shelf it came from. So cataloging became the way in which the Buddhist canon was seen. It's not divided by teaching. It's not really divided by people who said, oh, we're going to go through all of these books and we're going to do it by subject matter. That's what the Library of Congress catalog is. Those little numbers on the spine of a book are subject categories. For the Chinese, there was no way that they knew to do that. Instead, any indication of the divisions on the Buddhist canon had to do with the physical library way of housing the books. It was a shelf list. So the catalog became based on the way in which they were shelved. And when someone went into a library to make a catalog, primarily it was a shelf list, the exact order in which the books appear on the shelves. There were a lot of catalogs. I mentioned before that Daoan in the 4th century we think, made the first real attempt to make a catalog of all the Buddhist manuscripts he could find. But they weren't yet in libraries. When Daoan made his catalog, he just tried to find out and went around and asked, can I see what manuscripts you have? I'm going to try to find out exactly how many manuscripts do we have in China? What are they? What texts are in those manuscripts? It didn't necessarily mean that they were put in a shelf list order by Dawan, because he was not looking at a library. He was looking at an inventory of texts that appeared in people's private collections or in a monastic collection. So finally, Dawan's catalogs disappeared. We don't have a copy. However, we reconstructed. There was another catalog made called the Chusan Zanjiji. And that catalog indicates if the manuscript that they're cataloging existed in Dawan's catalog. So looking at that later catalog from the 6th century, we can reconstruct what Dawan's catalog must have looked like. However, by the 8th century, it was a different matter for cataloging. Cataloging had to reflect the fact that by the 8th century, the number of Chinese Buddhist texts had expanded into the thousands, and they had a way of they were shelved. And so in the 8th century, that is, we think 730 of the Common Era, a catalog was made of one of the libraries. It's called the Kaiyuan Bu. It was done during what's the reign name of the emperor, who was Kaiyuan, his early name in the Tang Dynasty. I show you a picture of some of the coins from his reign with the words Kaiyuan on them. So when this catalog was made, there was a big shift, I think. It became the standard for the canon. It was no longer just shelf lists that people relied on, because the shelf lists from different monasteries could, of course, be quite different. Instead, this composed catalog of the 8th century became the example of what the Buddhist canon was considered to be in 730. So we now have shelf lists. The shelf lists get standardized. The standardized shelf list begins to appear in written catalogs. Once they appear in written catalogs, the order that the texts appear in the catalog becomes the way that everybody puts them on their shelf. So it starts with the shelf, goes to a book. The book then determines how you shelf your material. But we're still back to the old problem. How did they figure out what to do with the fact that they had in the libraries, divided up, as was the tradition, all these manuscripts and scrolls into 10 per box or case? Well, the Chinese, of course, didn't have alphabet. We alphabetize. So if I go into the card catalog or I try to index what I have in a book, I can do it. We have 26 letters. Whatever the alphabet you use, you can take the alphabet because everybody knows the arrangement of the alphabet. We teach children to sing it, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Everybody knows the order of the alphabet. Well, what if you don't have an alphabet? What instead of an alphabet, you have hundreds of what we call glyphs, characters, and they aren't in any order. What do you use? Well, the Chinese solution to this was to write down 1,000 characters in a rather way that we could say is poetic. They were characters that had sound and rhyme to them. And these 1,000 characters were the way in which all Chinese were taught. The first thing you did was you learned the 1,000 characters, and you learned them in the order of the poetic, rhythmic, metric that had been composed for them. And because everybody knew the order, then you could use it as a classification scheme. So for example, this is a picture of the first part of the 1,000 characters. I've selected out character 2, meaning Earth. But everybody had learned that that's the second character. So since it's the second character, if I put it on something, it may not be a number, but it indicates that in a sequence, whatever the sequence is, what I have put before you is the second in this sequence. So everybody had to learn the 1,000 characters. You not only had to learn how to write them, and this was a way to teach children how to write Chinese characters, still is often done. And you learn them in the exact order so that you had a classification scheme ready. And that's what the Buddhist text came into contact with. It's called the Chinsawan. It's called the 1,000 character classic. So how did they use the 1,000 characters? Here's a traditional Chinese Buddhist text. I've marked it with, it's marked with the Chinese, but you can see the double lines moving toward 2 characters. So usually if you want to know what the 1,000 character classic character is for the text you're looking at, you look down below the title until you see a single character floating by itself. Or if it has a number with it, it means this one is the first of the 1,000. And this is the first one of the units that are placed under this. So what the Chinese did was to move then back to the shelf where they had these boxes, these shelves with 10 scrolls together, usually. And on each box, they put one of the 1,000 characters. And so you could have 1,000 boxes. Everybody could know at least the order in which the boxes were occurring. If you reach the end of the 1,000, you could then just keep going by making the first character doubled. And that says, I'm in the second series of the 1,000 characters. And if you wanted to go farther, you could triple it. So this was a way in which the thousands of manuscripts placed in boxes on library shelves could be designated and classified in terms of sequencing them and identifying them. So here you can see in another one, how down below the title, you have the big character. Then we see that this one is the 6th page of this 1,000 character classic, which has been used now when you make a new copy to go into the library, you put the classification on it. In other words, it's like putting the Library of Congress categories that we see on the spine of a book. They actually incorporated this into the structure of the canon itself. And that's the way in which you could keep track. At Fengshan, they decided to, and over centuries, made stone carvings of the Buddhist canon. And at first, they didn't use the 1,000 character classic. It makes it very difficult to figure out exactly where you are because there's just the title. However, in the later period, they started imitating a printing block, and they carved a stone, and sure enough, there it is. They put the 1,000 character classic. So whenever I look at two or versions of a Chinese Buddhist canon, if I want to know how it's arranged, first thing you begin to look for is, what is the 1,000 character classic on this text? Is it the same as this text has in another edition? Are they two editions in which the sequence of how you arrange the material in the canon is the same? So it's identification, it's classification, it's a way to keep tabs. Children today are still taught. This is the way you teach them. These are the 1,000 characters that they're learning in sequence. They're trying to help them by putting cute cartoons and other memory aids so that as the children absorb and begin to write each of these 1,000 characters, it's not so hard for them to swallow. Well, you can see what a task it is to learn all the Chinese characters. That even a child has to learn at least 1,000. And they're complicated. They're not simple characters. Some are, but many are very complicated. So I'm going to now talk about a little bit about how this works out in a library. I'm going to go to Hain Monastery in Korea. There we have over 80,000 printing blocks. The printing block has two sides. It contains 2 pages. And how do you make a way to house the printing blocks? So the 1,000 character classic is used. We know that these pages belong to a certain character. And that helps us keep it in order up to a point. And if we put the number of the block within that 1,000 character classic, then we're able to proceed. So I started working with this collection. It was one of the first things I saw when I first went to Korea in 1970, a long time ago. I went to Haeinsa. Hard to get there at that time. I had to take old country buses on back roads that took me up into the mountains, and I wasn't sure where I was going. And then I arrived and I came across this place. It changed my life. I was absolutely fascinated by it. And so I made a vow that I would catalog it. And that's my volume from UC Press, the catalog of the Korean Buddhist Canon, is a catalog of these printing blocks. When I looked at this and cataloged it, I realized that it contains a history of its acquisition. For example, the K numbers, the sequential numbers. The texts numbered 1 through 1087 are identical to the old Chinese Kaibao edition. And they appear to be tracings of the Kaibao. So that what we have in those first 1,087 texts that are in the Korean printing blocks, they are a Xerox copy of the old Kaibao edition. There was a period of time where no texts were translated. It was picked up again in the 10th century, though, by the Northern Sung. They began once again to make translations, as I mentioned before. So if we look at the Korean text from 1088 to 1256, those belong to a new set of printing that was shipped from China to Korea. The Koreans received this new set of texts, and in the order that they were received, they simply put them on their library shelf. In other words, they didn't try to mingle them with the older texts that they already had. They didn't try to make it, oh, I'm going to go and put all the Diamond Sutra section together, and I'm going to do one on that deals with the life of the Buddha, etc. They didn't do that. They simply added it to the library shelf. Later, they also received texts, tantric texts. Tantric texts had not been included in the Kaibao. That's because most of them were translated after the original cataloging of the Kayan Mu. When they made a set of the Kaibao, the first set of printing blocks, they followed the catalog. If it wasn't in the catalog, they didn't do it. So the Koreans got a set of these uncatalogued by the Kayan Lu. They got a new set of these. And once again, they didn't try to intermingle them. They just added them, as you can see, 1262 text number, and it goes all the way to 1,395. Then we look at those and we see, well, these were translations made from 700 to 798. And our first collection from the Northern Sung, those translations had been made from 983 to 999, whereas the Kaibao was only translations made up to 725. Then a second group of texts came from the Northern Sung, and these became the Korea number 1000 to 1090. So what we see is that part of the way in which the canon was arranged had nothing more to do than the way in which it was acquired. With each of these sets that came to the Koreans, they just simply added them to their shelf and left them in exactly the order of acquisition. So I do want to mention finally that for the Chinese Buddhist canon, we have a visual reference. You can catalog them by the images that were placed at the beginning of the scroll. In other words, the same image would be used at a period of time for the entire set of scrolls. So I want to look always at this visual reference. It's a visual reference, but it's a way of cataloging visually by saying, and of course, it's almost impossible to figure out how in the world you would ever make much use of it, because if I'm cataloging just by pictures, then how do I know which picture to put where, etc.? Nevertheless, it helps us to know that. So this is what I mean by saying how important the library was to help us understand how the Chinese Buddhist canon came together. It came together in piecemeal. It came together over centuries. People had to figure out how to sequence it, in what order to put the text. They had to develop an idea of whether they would number the cases, the boxes, 10 scrolls. Would they number each scroll? Within the scroll, would they number each of the pages it took to make the scroll? It was a detailed and complicated process. So in a way, what the Chinese Buddhist canon is a library shelf list. And we today have the Taisho version from Japan in the 20th century. They tried to rearrange the whole thing and say, oh, we don't want to leave it like this. This has no meaning. What we want to do is to become very scientific. So in the 20th century, the great printing process of the Taisho Tripitaka, as they call it, that Taisho edition was done by trying to place the material in the order in which it was taught by the Buddha. And it's difficult, as you might imagine. And it doesn't really make much, it doesn't help us that much, I think. I believe the old tradition, which was started by Dawan, and he said, well, what shall we start with? What shall be the first text? And he said, well, it should be a really important text shouldn't start this Buddhist canon with some insignificant little text. We should start with the most important text. And what would that be? Well, it would be the perfection of wisdom. Why? Because the perfection of wisdom is the mother of bodhisattvas. All bodhisattvas in the Mahayana tradition have come from the perfection of wisdom. And which perfection of wisdom should we start with? The largest. And what is the largest? 100,000 line Prajnaparamita, 600 scrolls. That's the most important one. Let's start with that one. The Japanese Taisho edition did away with that. We don't come to that text until we come to the document number 220, way down the list. So we still are dealing with the issues of how shall you arrange it? Is there a better way than we have? What do we do when we have a digital version? All of these are new questions. Now, if all of this has inspired you a little, and I hope it has a little bit, I really recommend Spreading the Buddha's Word in East Asia by Zhang Mu and Lucille Jai. Zhang Mu at Arizona and Professor Jai at University of California, Riverside. From this, you can also fill in a lot of the gaps of the, as it says, the formation and the transformation of the Chinese Buddhist canon. It doesn't always follow exactly the order in which I presented this to you today, but you will find in it a great deal of information which will help you as you try to figure out what role did library science play in structuring the Chinese Buddhist canon. Thanks very much.